someone manipulating them. You can imagine someone painting through all those little holes through the wires and making the sand come through. Amazing work.
There's so many. Do they all have a system of planets?
Most of them.
A lot of the concepts in Star Wars are very hard to really go into in a simple way because they're far too complex in the end.
Really?
Yeah, I put him out there as a very superficial thing. It's really, you'd have to really start pulling it apart and to spend a lot of time to get to the bottom of what's really going on, especially in terms of the thematic issues that are involved in most of this. This part is the part that gives us a little bit more breadth to the movie and characters, especially that of Anakin.
The reading's off the chart. Over 20,000. No survivors. What does that mean? This little area where we were shooting was about 30 miles out into the desert, and the first night we were there, it rained like you have never seen before. The wind had picked up so hard that it actually created a small tornado. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, the production manager and I, David Brown and Peter Heslop and I, tried to drive out to the set. We got stuck in our Jeep about a quarter of the way to the set. We couldn't get any communication out with our security guards. And we actually had to walk back. We arrived back at the hotel at about 4:30 in the morning, got a transport vehicle that we knew that could basically get us out. And we went out and we saw nothing but total devastation. I mean, virtually every single thing was destroyed except for one ramp. I have a friend named Robert Claus, and he's noted for his funny, almost goofy laugh, and I recorded him, and we dubbed it in the streets of Mos Eisley in a few places. And so those of us that know Robert Claus get an additional laugh when we hear his laugh in the streets. Patience is my good friend. We'll have your winnings before the sun sets. We'll be far away from here. The ship belongs to me. I was always very interested in the classic sound effects of cinema, and Star Wars films, of course, have many opportunities for electronic sounds to occur, such as sparks, and zaps, and bolts of lightning, and laser bolts, and a lot of that material I actually recorded many years ago. You may remember that in the classic Frankenstein movies done 60 years ago, there was all this fabulous laboratory equipment in Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory. I did some research years ago that all of those props were built by a man named Ken Strickfat. And he had a traveling science show in the United States way back in the 1920s. He went around demonstrating all these fabulous devices he had built to show off electricity and magnetism. Well, Universal, I guess, hired him to build the props for Frankenstein. And it turns out that he was still living back during the time of Empire Strikes Back. And I went to his house and visited him in the hopes of recording some of his devices, and lo and behold, he had all of them there in his garage. And he hadn't been to the movies for about 10 or 15 years at that point. At first, he didn't want me to record any of his devices. For some reason, he was a bit protective about it and wasn't very friendly. But I was persistent. I invited him down to the Academy to see a 70mm print of Empire Strikes Back that I had to check by myself in the theater. So he and I sat alone in the theater, and he saw The Empire Strikes Back. And I can remember seeing him silhouetted against the screen, and he just loved the movie. He hadn't seen anything like it in his life, and he was probably 85 years old at that point. And I drove him home, and he said, come on in the back, Ben. And he turned on all of his Frankenstein devices, and the place lit up with sparks and bolts flying back and forth. And I stayed at his house overnight and spent part of the next day recording all of his devices. And A lot of that machinery provided raw material, which I've used many times over. And I still discover new things in those recordings, which apply to the Star Wars sound design.
Never won a race? Well, not exactly. Not even finished. Kidsters were it. I will this time.
Of course you would. At one time, there were a number of scenes of the probe droid that was tracking down Anakin's movements. But it's very typical of the Star Wars films and the way that George Lucas works is that a character or a story thread will develop, and later on that element has to be reduced, but it isn't normally tossed out entirely. It still will find its way into the frame or into the soundtrack somehow.
This was a scene that I'd always wanted to do, which is a large sort of epic production number with thousands of extras and lots of different kinds of vehicles and big scope that was grasped on the first 3 movies. And so this was a little bit of an indulgence to be able to take the kind of action that we did in outer space, which was not that hard, and put it into a real environment, especially with alien creatures and strange vehicles.
It's probably like 6 weeks to 12 weeks to actually animate a shot like this, and yet you can't hardly see anything in there. But we've got, 4 mantas and a bunch of Eopies and 100, human beings walking around and a bunch of the pod race drivers, and it's incredible.
That's my pod. I almost set it backwards. The whole engine thing in front, that would be kind of hard to deal with for me because of having it stuck in front of me instead of behind me to where I can't see him. I'd rather have him behind me to where I can't see him and have a little droid like Luke gets. How come I don't get it the easy way? How come he gets the easy way?
This leads us into one of our other favorite characters, Sebulba. He was fascinating from the start, from the design phase, because he walks on his hands. Here's an example of the clothing software helping us with what we call the jangly bits, or the dangling parts on Sebulba. They really help make this character come alive. I love how he plays with his whiskers, and then he plays with his goggles.
Use your instincts.
I will.
May the force be with you.
The announcer's booth is a quarter-scale miniature with CG characters in there. And the return of Jabba the Hutt. Generated, of course, inside a miniature.
Jabba's aide there on the right is Matt Wood on the sound of
One of the little rat crews running away. So even in these wide shots, we're doing digital creatures and digital extras to help fill out the scene.
stadium miniatures about 40 feet across. And in shots like this, some of the people that are in the background are Q-tips that were part of the miniature, and we just replaced the ones where you could see them clearly enough that you could see that they were Q-tips. We replaced those with CG people, and in some cases, rows of generic people that we shot on high 8.
There were a lot of challenges with this race because of the fact that one of these